Hello, I'm Sam Strubala, and welcome to episode 6 of Politics World with Sam Strubala. The 2017 general election cycle has been one full of surprises. Gone are the polls that saw Jeremy Corbyn's Labour Party trail the Conservatives by as many as 20 or even 25 points, and we now have a much tighter race on our hands. Yet the polls are not in agreement. ICM recently had the Conservatives with an 11-point lead, while Salvation had the Tory lead at just a single point. So what do we make of these increased Labour figures? And what is the future of the polling industry following the 2015 general election and Brexit when it came under tremendous scrutiny? I now have the pleasure of welcoming Keiran Pedley, Research Director at GfK and host of the Polling Matters podcast. Keiran Pedley, welcome to the show.
Hi Sam, good to be with you.
Now, we've seen the figures for Labour improve dramatically over the past couple of weeks in what's sort of been called a Corbyn Surge. Yet, as I noted at the top of the show, we see radical differences between polls in terms of how far Labour are behind the Conservatives. Why are we seeing such different numbers, and what can we read into it?
Well, the first thing to say is that the polls show a reasonably consistent picture in terms of what's happening in this election campaign. The Conservatives started a long way ahead, and the Labour Party have significantly narrowed the gap. Where you rightly point out there is a difference is in terms of how much that gap has narrowed and what the gap now is. And you mentioned ICM, there's also Comres that have a gap of about 12 points, and Salvation, yes, are around 1 or 2 today, but YouGov also around the 4-point mark, and there's others in between as well. And really the difference can be explained very simply by how pollsters treat turnout. So one of the findings in the 2015 polling inquiry, following the obviously the poll error at the 2015 general election, was that the sample that pollsters were using was not necessarily representative of the population that votes. Now, that will partly be to do with who shows up at the polling station, and partly to do with and comparing that to who takes part in opinion polls. And the idea is that people that take part in opinion polls are a bit too engaged, and that has a habit of skewing people a bit left. So, and therefore overstating Labour. So some pollsters are essentially modelling turnout based on, to all intents and purposes, what happened last time or what has happened historically in the past. And that's what you're seeing companies like ICM and Comres do. On the other hand, you've got pollsters that are trying to treat the problem, if you like, at the sampling stage, and are still treating turnout in a self-reported fashion, meaning that maybe you take people that say I am 10 out of 10 certain to vote and you trust them at their word. Now, on the one hand, what the people that are doing that are doing is possibly the best long-term solution, which is to try and deal with the problem at the source and get a genuinely representative sample of voters taking part in polls. There are question marks as to whether they're fixing the issue in 2015, and we simply don't know the answer to that question at the moment. And I think it's important for your listeners to appreciate that most of the pollsters get quite similar results in their voting intention polls at the moment before they apply some sort of turnout weighting or sort of turnout factoring into what they eventually produce. So this isn't necessarily a case of the pollsters getting different sort of ingredients into their poll at the moment. It just seems like they're treating the results in a different way. And at the moment, as you say, there's a big disparity between the different pollsters, and we're going to learn a lot from what happens on polling day.
Well, another sort of poll that we've seen going about is in terms of leadership ratings, which has of course been one of the focal points of this campaign. Has Jeremy Corbyn been a competent leader of the Labour Party? Of course, the Conservatives essentially just running on the fact that Theresa May was their leader to start off the campaign. How important are things such as leadership ratings as opposed to sort of these frontline polls that just talk about voting intention? How much stock should we really be putting into these sort of polls?
Lots is probably the answer. I think it's very important to look at not just the horse race, as we sometimes call it in the industry, so what you've referred to there, which is the state of the parties, It's also important to look at the fundamentals. Some people call them the internals or whatever, but basically the supplementary questions that get asked. You've talked about leader ratings, but it's also worth looking at things like the issues, what's on people's minds as they're going to the polling station. We know that Labour voters much more interested about the NHS, Conservative voters very motivated by Brexit, not least because a lot of Conservative voters are historically UKIP voters now as well. But to go back to, or were UKIP voters, to go back to your point about leadership ratings, though, there is a very clear pattern that's been told from what they've said during the campaign, which is that Jerry Corbyn, as you rightly identified, started off not just with bad ratings, but with some of the worst leader ratings of any leader of the opposition in history. And he significantly narrowed the gap with Theresa May, and he's done that by essentially bringing Labour voters home and sort of convincing small people that normally vote for small parties or people that normally don't vote to vote for him, or at least that's what the polls say. And we'll have to see what happens on polling day. On the flip side, Theresa May has had a terrible campaign. I think that's subjectively the case. It may yet not matter in terms of her sort of victory or otherwise. But, we all know about the campaign, U-turning on the social care plan, not showing up to debates, having a very stilted sort of demeanour in media interviews. All of this has hurt the Conservatives because ultimately they based their whole campaign on her brand, on her being strong and stable, the phrase she uses, and the safe pair of hands and all the rest of it, and that seems to have been challenged. Now, what that's shown in the numbers, though, is that her rating has taken a bit of a tanking. Jeremy Corbyn's has improved, but she's still broadly ahead, or at the worst case scenario, neck and neck. And that can be if you're asking people whether they're satisfied with each candidate, whether they think they're doing well or badly, whether they approve or disapprove, whatever measure you want to use, the gap is narrowing. The issue for the Labour Party, though, is that when you force people to make a choice, and you say which would you prefer in Downing Street, who would you prefer to be the Prime Minister, then Theresa May still wins, and she wins by anywhere between 10 and 15 points over Corbyn on that. Now that points to a result not dissimilar to what we saw in 2015, because the gap between David Cameron and Ed Miliband was about that gap as well. Now, the result itself, which we may come on to, is a whole, there's all sorts of different things that go into that may make it different from 2015, even with similar results. But to answer your question, yes, they're really important because you need to understand what people think of the people that they're potentially going to vote for, but also you need to understand what people are thinking of when they go to the ballot box.
Now, there you mentioned that Labour and Corbyn were bringing Labour voters home. And as we've seen sort of this Corbyn surge and Labour surge, how much of this do you feel is simply them bringing voters home? How much of this surge really isn't a surge in that they should have had these voters wrapped up at a much earlier stage of the campaign?
Well, the irony is if they had done, maybe there wouldn't have been a campaign at all, because I suspect the polling gap was a lot of the reason why this election is even happening in the first place. Look, there's definitely something in the idea that Labour voters are being brought home. One of the quirks in the methodology of opinion polls that are produced in the UK is that for quite a lot of pollsters, if you say don't know to the voting intention question, you're stripped out of the numbers. Now, that's not 100% the case. ICM have a policy where they kind of reallocate people back in if they say don't know, based on how they voted last time. And there's a complex way they do that, which you can read about on their website. But the point is that there were quite a lot of Labour voters in the past saying that they didn't know who they'd vote for in a hypothetical future election. And they were being stripped out, therefore, of voting intention polls. So it was quite... they were a sort of low-hanging fruit in a way, or theoretically at least, to bring back into the Labour fold. People that probably were always going to vote Labour, but maybe were telling pollsters 6 months ago or even 6 weeks ago that they weren't sure how they were going to vote. But I think it's fair to say that the Corbyn surge, and again we should remember, insofar as there is one, I mean, if ICM or Comrades turn out to be right, then we're talking about a gap that was 20 that's now 12 and a 100-seat Conservative majority, but we'll wait and see whether they are right. The Corbyn surge is driven by other things too, and I was looking at some numbers from a Survation poll today, which shows the gap at 2 points, and I don't really want to focus on the gap, but just where the Labour vote is coming from. And what you find if you look at the Labour vote now and how it split out in 2015, you find that about 1 in 5 Labour voters now either didn't vote in 2015, maybe they were too young, or maybe they just were non-voters historically, or they voted for other parties, particularly the Greens. And I guess a real question is going to be: is that accurate? Are 1 in 5 Labour voters going to the polls on Thursday going to be people that didn't vote or voted Green last time? I'm a bit sceptical about that, but you never know. I mean, this would make sense, I suppose, that the people that support Corbyn could be those types of people. So, the Corbyn surge is a complex picture. We should, though, always bear in mind that we're not quite sure to what effect that surge will have on the result.
Well, you mentioned there that if there is a Corbyn surge, some of it may be coming from Green voters. In this election, the Liberal Democrats and the Green Party certainly had Brexit at the centre of their campaign. They're sort of the two parties that were trying to represent the Remain vote, but neither have really been able to capture this. Are we seeing, in terms of salience of issues, that Brexit simply hasn't been that important an issue at this election?
Well, that's a really interesting question, and I think I have been struck by how little Brexit has been discussed at this election. And the best explanation I can give for that fact is that the two main parties that would form a government both accept the result. And I think that, to be fair, whether you supported Remain or Leave, I think you have to conclude that Jeremy Corbyn was right not to go into this election calling for a second referendum, because I think that would have caused a real problem for the Labour Party. Not least because public opinion right now seems basically to say, get on with it. I think that is the prevailing mood. And people talk about the 48%, if you like, the Remain vote. But it's not a monolithic block of people. Around 1 in 4, Remain voters kind of want to get on with it. They accept the result. They don't want a second referendum. That's one of the things that we've been seeing on our podcast with a polling series that we're running with Opinion. Now, that may change, and people listening to this will rightly point out Brexit hasn't happened yet. So maybe 6 months from now, once the negotiations are in full force, if things aren't going very well, then the message that the Greens, or probably in reality more likely the Liberal Democrats, have pushed might resonate more, and you might start to see again some more success at the ballot box for the Lib Dems. As an aside, we don't quite know how bad it's going to go for them on Thursday. Maybe they'll do better than we expect. But nevertheless, you're right, there has been no Lib Dem surge. So I think really it's just a question of timing for those parties. Theresa May's called this election just before Brexit actually happens. I think for now, the prevailing mood in the public, as I've said, is to get on with the job. Whether that lasts, who knows?
Now, obviously, in the past few years at the 2015 general election at Brexit, we've seen the polling industry come under quite a bit of scrutiny in public. We had Tom Brake on our last podcast, and he sort of was saying he doubts the polls nowadays. How has the polling industry sort of adapted over the last couple of years? How has polling changed to sort of fix the perceived issues that were there?
Well, I mean, even as a pollster, I sympathise with what Tom is saying. It's very difficult, and I mean, we have to remember that voting intention polling is a very unique thing. What you're trying to do is to extrapolate from a survey how people are going to behave in the future. And in this particular case, we're talking about an election, and surveys do that in other walks of life as well, such as trying to understand if people are going to buy a certain car, or how they're going to respond to a certain advert and that sort of thing. So it is really difficult, and you've got to have an accurate reflection of who's going to show up on the day, and that's an ever-moving target based on divided loyalties. People seem to be shopping around for the parties that best support their views, and which is ironic, really, when you consider that the two main parties look like they might get the joint highest vote share that they've ever got at this election, but we'll wait and see what happens. How have pollsters changed their methodology? Well, in different ways. You won't be surprised for me to say that. As I kind of alluded to at the beginning, what's going into the polls is quite similar in terms of the sample. If the pollsters didn't treat turnout differently, they'd all produce quite similar results. The biggest thing that they're doing is they're sort of trying to wait for turnout either in terms of what's happened in the past, or let people self-report. I won't go into all the detail of that again because I did that earlier. Another thing they're trying to do is to look at sampling, and one of the things they're trying to do is to take questions from the British Elections study, and other related surveys that are face-to-face, that are random probability, that are, to use that phrase, gold standard, and they're trying to sort of extrapolate from what people say there, and compare that to what's going on in online polls, and polls are usually online now, and try and match the sample up. So to put some numbers to that, normally in online surveys you get a sample that is more interested in politics than face-to-face surveys tell you that the actual population is. So one of the things you can do is you can get your sample from the online survey and you can weight the numbers to be more reflective of the wider population, essentially down-weighting people that are interested in politics, because we know that we have too many of them in our online samples. So, without repeating myself from earlier, it's a combination of sampling and how you deal with turnout. And we will see on Thursday who's got it right.
Now, in the past couple of days, just to finish off, we've seen YouGov make a forecast for the election, and we've been seeing them across the internet. Are you willing to make something of a prediction now of what you think the final result will be?
Famous last words. It's it's a very difficult question. Not least because vote share and how that transitions into seats is very volatile. It's volatile not least because UKIP are not standing in every seat. In fact, UKIP are actually standing in less seats than the Green Party. And we know there was an awful lot of UKIP votes last time that are now kind of available. So in terms of a prediction, I would, if I had to put a gun to my head and look at the polls and say which ones where I thought it was, I would say a vote share for the Conservatives of anywhere between 7 to 10 points ahead of Labour. I think that in reality, the polls that show the race neck and neck give me a sort of implausible sense of how the Labour vote is constructed for reasons I mentioned earlier. Young voters, Green voters, non-voters. We may have egg on our face, and Salvation may be crowing, and YouGov to a lesser extent at their success. But I just find it hard to believe that Labour can put together an electoral coalition of, in the upper 30s on the basis of that. So, I would be looking at the Tories in maybe mid to low 40s and Labour in sort of the mid 30s. And then in terms of seats, very hard to say, but I guess it could be anywhere between sort of 50 to 80, depending on where the vote, how the vote falls. And I won't sort of commit to a particular majority in the House of Commons. But if you look at the seats, there are an awful lot of Brexit-leaning seats in the north of England and in the Midlands that the Conservative Party don't need a swing of much more than a couple of percent to take from Labour. And those are the ones that I'm looking at and thinking there are Conservative gains to be had there. And you've got to have an awful lot of young people and an awful lot of Greens in those sort of northern and Midland seats that I'm not even sure exist to be able to counterbalance that. And that's before we even talk about Scotland and some of the interesting things that are going on there. So I expect Theresa May to increase her majority relatively solidly, but at the same time, look, we could be surprised. We didn't, the conventional wisdom didn't expect a Remain vote, didn't expect Hillary Clinton to lose, and we know there is a feeling that people want to kick the establishment and kick the system at the moment, and maybe electing Jeremy Corbyn would be a way, or at least producing a result that's neck and neck, and therefore a hung parliament would be a way of doing that. I'm just not convinced that when it comes to it, Labour has the votes.
Keiran Pedley, thank you for joining us on today's show.
Good to be with you.
This has been Politics World with Sam Strubala. I'd like to again thank our guest, Keiran Pedley, and thank you all for listening. Remember, you can download our podcast now on iTunes. Go to the iTunes store and type in Politics World with Sam Strubala. Also remember, you can watch all of our content on our YouTube channel. I'm Sam Strubala, thanks again to Keiran Pedley, and thank you for listening.